Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 8 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 7 video, which was quite exhaustive by the way, my apologies for it being so long. I actually didn't realize it was that long until it was done, and then I was like, oh, what the hell, I'm going to post it. But in that round 7 game, I had a marathon affair that I was really fortunate to draw. And yeah, it really gave me a new lease on life because it was a game that I should have lost 99 times out of 100. And somehow I managed to escape in that one time out of 100 and hold on to the rope and draw. And that was a huge, huge game just for saving my tournament. It meant that I had a new lease on life. And so going into the last 2 rounds, I knew I'd never have as bad a position as I did in round 7, and it was a real chance to keep my decent tournament going because I'd only lost 1 game through 7 rounds. In this one, my opponent was a young, talented German player by the name of Alexander Krastev, and he was a FIDE master rated around 2340, and I wasn't surprised that I was playing down again because having drawn my last game against a German FIDE master, I knew I'd play someone around the same level. So I was hoping to just recover and play a better game than I did in round 7 and, yeah, just see what happens. So without further ado, I was black and white opened with knight f3. I went d5, and then he played very quickly g3. And in the past few tournaments, I had been going for basically Queen's Gambit decline setups with knight f6 and e6. And I figured being a very young player, he'd also seen those games and potentially came up with an improvement. So I thought, given that he was going for this fianchetto, I probably should not go for the lines I normally go for and basically take the game in a different direction. Again, I'd had tons of games in the past, few tournaments where I'd gone e6, bishop g2, knight f6, and then castles, bishop e7, c4, castles d4. And so, these types of closed Catalan positions I feel relatively comfortable with, but I did have a few losses, like against David Birches in the March GMIM Invitational, and I had another tough game in that tournament against Gauri Shankar with queen c2. So I thought I should just be a little bit different. And again, when you're playing in these tournaments, particularly when there's 1 game a day and there's a lot of extensive preparation that happens, you really want to be a moving target, because if you're a static opening guy, you have the opportunity or the potential to actually get caught in the opening with a new idea. And so I was like, not today. And because of that, after g3, I went for knight f6. And knight f6 doesn't change the story just yet. I could still follow up with e6. But after bishop g2, I went for c6. And basically, by not playing e6 right away, I allow my bishop to come outside the pawn chain, and the position takes on a different character, where black is essentially trying to develop the bishop out and say, I have no bad pieces. So that was pretty much my aim, to get something along the lines of like a reverse London system, where this bishop pops out to f5 or g4. White now castled. I did go bishop f5, and then d3 was played, and I went e6. And this is pretty much the London system setup reversed. The idea is that black has this triangle of pawns, a bishop on f5, and just a very solid position with pretty seamless development. On the flip side, white is typically trying to play for c4, or in some cases e4, to challenge this bishop or exert pressure on the center with one of those pawns. Now, typically when you play the bishop out to f5, it's almost inviting e4 because it comes with a tempo. But on a lot of positions, black just drops the bishop back without capturing and argues that the pawn tension here is actually one that he doesn't want to release. And we're going to get into that a little bit later, because you're going to see that this pawn tension is a very pervasive element of the position. So anyways, after e6, white went knight bd2. Another option instead of knight bd2 in this position is actually to play knight h4, trying to catch this bishop. In a lot of structures, if black just drops it back like this exchange can be somewhat desirable for white because he has the bishop pair, and then he's able to replace the knight that he lost on f3 by putting the other one there. But in this position, it's not so easy to recoup the bishop pair because after knight h4, I can go bishop g4. And the point is now if you chase it around the horn, so to speak, with h3 and bishop h5, after g4, it would appear that black is, going to lose the bishop pair, but actually the very important move, knight f d7, hits the knight on h4 and makes it, very undesirable to secure the bishop under these circumstances, because after g takes h5, queen takes h4, it's white's pawn structure that's kind of shattered on the queen side, or on the king side, and there are some very weak dark squares around those pawns as well. So because of this knight f d7 finesse, white would probably need to go back with knight f3, and now black could just put the bishop back on g6, and you could see the knight's no longer there to capture it. So it's actually a fairly typical maneuver that black can execute in some positions to actually ensure the preservation of his bishop after it's chased around the horn. So important to keep that theme in mind if you ever find yourself in London positions. So anyways, after e6, white did go knight bd2, and the difference here is that knight h4 is actually a threat. And the reason for that is, let's say I play a blah move like a6 just to sort of exemplify this. Now if knight h4, there's bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, g4, and after knight f d7, there's actually knight df3 protecting this knight. And you could see now that, queen takes h4 is not the same possibility. And after bishop g6, he actually can take very cleanly on g6 with his knight. Now, the line can continue here, and I could go for a move like bishop e7, challenging this knight again. But there's actually this funny-looking move, knight f5, that I've seen before. And the point is that after e takes f5, now he can secure the bishop on h5. And this position isn't as bad as the other positions because even though white has this weakness here, black has, quote-unquote, ruined his pawn chain a little bit with these double pawns, so it's actually a little bit more playable for white and somewhat justified. So this actually could have been another possibility in the position, but I was keenly aware of this maneuver with knight d2 and then knight h4, and so after knight d2 was played, I played h6 relatively quickly. And the point is now that that I played h6, my bishop on h7 has a square, pretty much. Or the bishop on f5 has a square on h7. So you can see the game of cat and mouse that, happens trying to nail down this bishop. But ultimately, it's very important to keep the bishop pair if you can. And I didn't want to cede it, unnecessarily. So now white went b3. This is another interesting way to play. Essentially putting this bishop on the long diagonal. And also gearing up for c4 in some positions. Again, the question for white is whether they're going to play with e4 or they're going to play with c4. Usually they can't do both, so they have to decide which one they want to play for. After b3, I went bishop e7, just developing. And now white went bishop b2. And now I castled. And yeah, I felt pretty good about my position here. I'm pretty well developed. I have this nice bishop on f5. And I just want to connect my rook. So all is okay so far. And now white went knight e5. Knight e5 is an interesting move, taking advantage of that e5 square, potentially trying to possibly anchor another knight on f3 and then e5. And also unleashing the bishop to facilitate the e4 break. So knight e5 is a very typical move in London type of setups. And this is like a reverse London, right? Where white tries to take advantage of the one square in the center with his pieces. In my opinion, it would still be a little bit better to go for c4 and play this way and just control the square from afar as opposed to occupying it. Because one of the things that you do when you play knight e5 is you allow me to challenge that knight right away. And I did that with knight bd7. And I was kind of happy to get this move in because my knight on b8 wasn't really doing anything right now. And to be able to challenge this knight on e5 that's quite active would be quite decent for me, I thought. After knight bd7, white went for e4. Kind of consistent with this plan of, trying to play in the middle and, again, justifying his last move, knight e5, arguing that the bishop on g2 was unleashed and that he's actually can support this break. And this is actually already an important question because you need to ask yourself, do you want to take on e4 with the pawn, or do you want to drop the bishop back to h7? Why don't you pause the video and think on it for a moment and then tune back in. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and come to a decision about this tension on e4. Do you want to take on e4, or do you want to play bishop h7 right away? I opted for bishop h7, and I think this is absolutely the correct move. And the reason for this is that you actually want to keep this pawn tension as black if you can, because if you take on e4, now white will go d takes e4 and have the d file to potentially operate on. And so after bishop h7 now, white can pop out with queen e2 and then try to get a rook to d1 and play along the d file. And I think this is something that's quite playable for white, and especially with these dark squares maybe being a touch sensitive. Whereas if you don't take, you're actually kind of keeping an annoying tension on e4, because note that if the knight on d2 moves, let's say to f3, well, this e4 pawn is just dropping. There's way too much pressure on it. So by keeping that pawn tension on h7, you don't open the file for white's rook, potentially coming to d1. But on the flip side, you also, freeze the knight on d2. So always important to think about pawn tension, whether it's favorable to you or not. And I thought this was positive pawn tension because white doesn't really want to take. If white plays e takes d5, I have two pretty attractive options. I could play c takes d5 and play along the half open c file with my rook, or I can even play e takes d5. Even e takes d5 is playable here. But to be honest, c takes d5 is way better. Just, I have more pawns around my king, so it's relatively secure. And getting the half-open c file is nice. And then the other thing is if white wants to shut this down, the counterplay on the c file, by pushing the c pawn, then the d3 pawn is sensitive. And that's the other thing that you want to keep in mind in London type of positions, is this bishop on h7 has a really important latent power in that it really has a lot of pressure on this diagonal. And if white releases the tension, the pawn tension in the center, all of a sudden it's really quite impactful. On the flip side, black should also be a little bit reluctant to release the tension, because then white's bishop on this diagonal becomes more of a force. So a lot of times in these structures, it's actually kind of a game of cat and mouse, or a staring contest to kind of see who wants to relieve the tension first, because neither side really wants to. So anyways, after bishop h7, white actually took knight takes d7, and I played knight takes d7. The reason I did this is because if queen takes d7, I was reluctant to ultimately allow a knight to come to e5 with tempo. Not right away, but if like queen e2 and then knight f3, knight e5, that's something I didn't want to deal with. So instead I went knight takes d7, and now white went queen e2. And this is probably one of the critical positions of the game, because I talked about this pawn tension and how it's super critical and no side really wants to release it. And so it's like, well, if I'm not playing in the middle right now, what do I do? Because note that as long as this tension exists, I can't really consider pushing e5 or c5, because the d5 pawn would be insecure and I'd open up the diagonal for this bishop. So really, instead of playing in the middle right now, I need to keep the tension and open up play elsewhere. And that's why I played the move a5. The idea with a5 is to soften up white's queen side a little bit with the move a4, and then get another nagging pawn tension on the queen side. Note that if a move like h3 is played, after a4, I always have this option of opening up the a file, and this would again be another positive pawn tension for black and a negative pawn tension for white, because white pretty much has to reluctantly just wait here, and if he releases the tension with b takes a4, you can see that after this exchange, white has managed to create an extra pawn island and a weakness on a2, whereas my whole structure is one lovely pawn chain. So very, very important, this concept of pawn tension and pawn chains, and that's why after a5, my opponent actually played a3. Or excuse me, not a3, he actually played a4. and his idea was to kind of not allow me to play a4. Now, you saw me play a3 by mistake, and the reason you saw that is actually because I think a4 is a mistake and a3 is a little bit better. The reason for that is now you're kind of covering the dark square on b4, and after a4, now white can play b4 and shut this counterplay down. Whereas here in the game, when he plays a4, he kind of has weak dark squares that as a consequence of that push, and I don't like it. I think these dark squares are just a little bit too sensitive and long-term weaknesses. And again, you want to try and limit the weaknesses you create in positions with your pawns, especially considering his whole complex on the queen side has softened up weak dark squares already. So I think a3 would just be a little bit more responsible to, sort of cover the complex a little bit more. After a4, I was keenly aware of this dark square weaknesses, and the question was, how do I take advantage of them? How do I attack them? How do I, make them become an issue? And I thought the way to do it was bishop f6. And I was really happy with this because my rationale was, if the bishops are gone and traded, then it's a lot easier to, take over these dark squares because there's nothing really guarding them. And I thought maybe I can go queen b6 or queen b4, maybe sometimes even knight c5, knight a6, knight b4, and just try to get my pieces to the queen side where they're sensitive. So I thought this trade would be very desirable for me. On the flip side, I'm actually inviting e5. And this is something that I really didn't mind inviting because if you recall, a little while ago, I mentioned how this bishop on h7 has some potential on this diagonal if the pawn on e4, ever moves. So by actually kind of provoking e5, I actually secure this diagonal for my bishop. Now, white kind of obliged and played e5, but I actually think, another option could have been to play d4 to kind of refuse the trade of the bishops and try to keep the tension in the center. Now, the flaw with d4 is that this bishop now still has a diagonal to work with, and by pushing the d pawn, the e4 pawn's a little bit sensitive. And again, you could see how white's pieces now are kind of tied to the defense of this pawn a little bit, because a move like knight f3 would just hang it. So you could see that it is kind of an unpleasant tension to deal with, and I think black is still kind of for choice, even though the computer claims this is an equal position or sometimes even slightly better for white. I just prefer the black side of it. So tough decision to make either way, but d4 is kind of maybe a little bit better. Instead, after e5, I went bishop e7 back, and even though I didn't get to trade the bishops, I happily got this diagonal for my bishop, so I felt pretty good here. Now, after e5, the position is kind of cut in two from the standpoint that white may have a kingside attack going, whereas black is going to need to get some queenside initiative going. And so white actually played f4, and now I actually understood that it might actually be a race, because even though f5 isn't a threat just yet, I could easily see white playing g4 and f5 and trying to steamroll me on the king side, maybe even tucking the king on h1. And I thought, okay, this is an interesting possibility, but it takes a lot of time, and it would weaken the king in the process if he shoves his pawns. And so I thought this was another really critical position where I had to act relatively quickly to kind of preempt these potential ideas. And now that I, had these squares that I was eyeing on the queen side, I wanted to rip the position open expeditiously. And that's why I opted for the move b5. And my idea was as follows. If b takes a4, either way that he takes on a4, I thought I would be opening up the queen side. So if he plays b takes a4, I thought then I have the open b file for my rook with rook b8, and that would give me a lot of counterplay. And if he goes rook takes a4, I thought I have knight b6 attacking that rook and then playing a4 and again opening up the position. And I thought both lines were kind of much faster than white's potential counterplay on my king, so I thought I was in good shape here. After b5, white played king h1. I think it's a reasonable move to get out of the line of fire because I might have played queen b6 with check. And so reasonable, but unfortunately a little bit too slow and doesn't, get anything going on the king side just yet. So now I'm able to continue with my operation. And I went b takes a4. And after rook takes a4, I went knight b6. And again, you can see how I am slowly about to rip open the queen side and get some play. Rook a2 was played. And I think the idea with putting it on a2 instead of a1 was to double the rooks. So that made some sense and was a good move. And now I went a4, and you can see he can't actually close up the position because b4 just drops a pawn. So I'm kind of fast on the queen side here, and he hasn't managed to get any initiative going on the king side. And I thought, the position is probably easier to play with black now because once this position opens up a little bit, the A and the B files will be a little bit sensitive. Another thing to note is that after A takes B3, you're going to have to take with the knight. And the reason for that is if you take with the pawn, then the D3 pawn is very weak. And already here, given that this diagonal was open, I was envisioning these pawns being targets. So keep that theme in mind. Whereas the flip side, this bishop is kind of shut down permanently. Even if I push c5, the e pawn is doing a great job reinforcing the d5 pawn. So it's really not an issue. White's bishop is not really an issue for me. So really, I think the London system in some respects can a lot of times be boiled down to the activity of the bishops and which ones are actually playing and which ones aren't. So anyways, after a4, white now went rook fa1, makes some sense, trying to at least retain control of the file. And I'm not in time to go queen c7 because then he secures a pawn. So I have to take on b3 right away. And I went a takes b3. And then black went rook takes a8, which is reasonable, and because it forces my knight to a8. And then knight takes a8. I don't love my knight on a8, to be honest. I mean, this is kind of almost the worst position on the board it could be in. But I thought that this was worth it given the fact I can reroute it back in the game and the queen side was a little bit sensitive. And after knight takes b3, I played queen b6. And the idea was queen b6 was to stop this white queen from potentially infiltrating, and also to cover the c5 and the c5 square and the a5 square, but in particular the c5 square. Because if I maneuvered my knight right away, let's say knight b6, well, there are many attractive moves here, but something like queen e3, eyeing this weak square could be nice. Also bishop d4, keeping an eye on these two squares are important, and I would not be able to retain control of these dark squares that I need to. So I thought queen b6 was really precise, and then I figured my knight on a8 can get into the game via c7 and try to eye some dark squares that way. Again, this whole plan was based on taking advantage of some of these dark squares. They're a little bit sensitive, and it also now evolved into pressure on white's queenside pawn. So still just trying to keep all the elements in the position alive. Now, if bishop d4 would be well met by c5, just kicking the bishop away. So anyways, after queen b6, rook a5 was played, and I actually think this move is a mistake. Now, he's trying to control c5, so that's kind of the idea. But I think the issue is that it's a little bit too artificial from the standpoint that this rook is very awkwardly placed here, and now the knight is obligated to protect it. And you might say, well, the knight wasn't going to be moving anytime soon anyway because the bishop is hanging. But the flip side is now two of his pieces are tied down. The knight on b3 can't move, and the rook on a5 is actually very awkward. So I thought that this is just an awkward configuration. Instead, the move that I was kind of trying to stop after queen b6, bishop d4 is actually better. Point being that after I play c5, you actually can just drop the bishop back to e3 and argue that your bishop is actually doing a decent job on this diagonal, pinning the c pawn. And I note that I'm not going to challenge that bishop because then I open up the other one. So this pin could be a little bit annoying and give white, reasonable play. Now, I actually still think it'd be easier to play black here. And after bishop e3, I can go knight c7 and reroute my knight to a6. And you can see my c5 pawn is well protected. My rook is about to get ready to get in the game. And I still am quite pleased with my position. But at least here, white would still, be fighting and have good enough counterplay against my pawns. Instead, this rook a5 move is the beginning of a kind of faulty plan. After rook a5, I went knight c7, trying to get my knight in the game. And the thing that I was already thinking about was either knight b5 or knight a6. And they both had kind of their pluses and minuses. If I go knight b5, I actually shut off this rook from the c5 square, and then I can maybe think about playing it right away. On the flip side, knight a6 enables me to also support c5 and consider jumping to b4. So I thought my knight, if I got this knight to one of these squares and was particularly active, that this would be a huge problem for white because his pieces are very loose. Bishop d4 was played now, challenging my queen. At least he's consistent with this rook a5 plan. The point is now he actually has 3 pieces on the square. And now it went for the move queen b4. And this was the point too, is that he's controlling the c5 square for now, so I can't play it. But now with queen b4, my queen is eyeing the d4 bishop. And also this knight is kind of frozen still. And even though he's controlling the square for now, it's very awkward to do anything critical on it with this queen being so active. In addition, my queen's also eyeing the e1 square. So if this queen on e2 was kind of foolish enough to leave the protection of e1, I have checkmating ideas because you have to block in a very awkward way that might lose material. So queen b4 is very active. And note that you can't challenge this queen in any way. Like c3 hangs the knight. Of course, bishop c3 just hangs the bishop. So the queen is very active here and is kind of unassailable. And then last but not least, I'm also threatening knight b5, which cuts off the rook's oxygen to the c5 square and also challenges the bishop on d4. So I was actually thinking I'm in a really good spot given this awkward situation that white finds himself in where it's hard to move his pieces. Note that another move, by the way, rook a7, which wasn't played, also kind of fails to knight b5. Point being that, you get this, you don't. My queen's actually protecting e7 as well, funnily enough. I was looking at lines like this, where, I actually think black is even better here because this rook is a very wayward rook and this queen is very active and the f rook can get into the game. But, wow, it actually turns out that from e7, from b4, my queen's actually protecting the e7 bishop. So again, excellent control here for black. So after queen b4, white actually went bishop c5, trying to trade these dark square bishops and, cement his control on the c5 square. But it's just not enough here. And after I trade, white has to play rook takes c5. And this rook is attacking c6, but it's in a very awkward spot without much support. Again, this knight is tied to the rook on c5. This pawn is only being attacked once, so it's relatively easy to protect. And by moving the rook to c5, he's ceding control of the a file, which you think would be kind of important given the fact that white has a pretty weak back rank right now and, just lacks coordination. So I think he's just going in for a pawn that's a bit too risky to go in for. I went queen b6, just protecting that pawn, and again, there's no way you can add additional pressure to it right now, so I thought, okay, this is going to be great for me. And now I'm also threatening knight a6, hitting that rook, eyeing the dark squares again, and it just seemed that, white was losing the thread a little bit. White now went queen d2, trying to add more ammunition to the c-pawn and continue to justify his rook on the square. But I think this was a major step in the wrong direction, and the computer actually confirms it. Instead, he should have tried to save face and play rook a5 and retreat back. and again try to take control of the A file and regroup a little bit and admit that this escapade to C5 didn't make a lot of sense. But of course, that's very difficult to do when your whole plan was based on that. And so, if he didn't already realize it wasn't a good plan, he was going to continue down that path. Here, though, again, black is for choice. I can go knight A6, and, again, my knight is coming in to B4. So after queen D2, I went knight A6, challenging the rook anyway, and you can see he's not even in time to double on the C file and pressure C6. So just a huge letdown on that front. And rook A5 was played. Although I want to point out that if queen A5 was played, trying to trade the queens and challenge my queen here, I honestly have a few really attractive ways to play. But the one that I was considering was just queen takes A5, believe it or not. Because after rook takes A5, I have knight B4. And now you can start to see just how difficult it is to hold these pawns in place. Because if you push C3, D3 is loose, and you can't really play rook A2 because my knight's covering that square. And if you go rook C5 back, now I can actually go rook A8 or rook B8 and infiltrate on this first or second rank. I think what I probably would have done is I would have gone rook A8 and then rook A8 like this. And again, this position is just not very pleasant to play at all because white is so active. Or excuse me, black is so active. Note that a move like knight D4, trying to protect C2 and attack C6, loses on the spot to rook A1 check. And like we said before, white has this weak back rank right now because the king is awkwardly placed on H1. So white would have to give up a bishop, and that would be the game. So just to kind of illustrate how difficult it already was in a position where the material is pretty equal. So anyways, after queen E2, knight A6, white went rook A5 back, now kind of acknowledging his mistake. But it's actually too late because my knight now is coming to B4, and I'm already in a position where I'm eyeing these weak pawns on D3 and C2. And look at the difference in bishops here. Massive difference in the bishops. My bishop is way better right now. After knight B4, white went queen C3. I think, again, trying to eye the C file here in the C5 square. At least I can't play C5 for now. But still, all his pieces are tied down. The knight is tied down. The rook is very awkwardly placed. Tactics are in the air. I started here with bishop G6, and I thought this was a really nice finesse. The point is that I was actually looking at rook B8 as my #1 candidate move, and the idea was actually to play a tactic with rook B8 connected to knight takes C2. The point is that after queen takes C2, I thought queen takes B3, I'm rook winning a piece. But actually, I have the same back rank problem that white does, where with my bishop on H7, if the 8th rank is cleared, rook A8 is actually mate. So I was thinking that instead of telegraphing my plan with rook B8, I actually would start with the move bishop G6 and solve my back rank problem because now I have king H7. And so I basically inverted the move order of my plan to kind of give him an opportunity to go wrong. And I thought this was a really, really clever approach because it's kind of tricky. It's not so obvious. If you didn't see rook b8 was a major threat, you kind of are like, well, what does bishop g6 do? But it gives myself a back rank and a square on h7, and I thought that's a tricky one. White now played h3, and this actually turns out to be the losing move. And it's really because, frankly, he did not see this idea. And yeah, it's actually amazing that it loses, but this bishop g6 move was very, very tricky, and he had to kind of realize what my threats were. Instead, really the only reasonable move to hang into the game was actually rook a1, retreating completely, covering the back rank, and just trying to play along the first rank. And now I can actually go rook c8 and try to prepare c5. And black is certainly in the driver's seat, but white can try to fight on. Note that if I play rook b8 now, white would go rook b1, and the knight on b3 is protected enough times so the knight takes c2 sack doesn't work. But instead, after h3 and then rook b8, the position is over because basically I'm threatening knight takes c2, and you can't do anything about it because you can't move the knight on b3 because it's protecting the a5 rook. And then, again, the rook can't come back to a2 because, well, it would be hanging there, and just everything is collapsing. And if you go rook a3, unfortunately, you do stop knight takes c2 and queen takes b3, but now because my rook is actually covering the b4 knight as well, I can infiltrate with queen f2. And there's a double attack on g3 and c2. So basically, after rook b8, the position just kind of collapses like a house of cards or dominoes or whatever thing you want to imagine that collapses, because after rook b8, there's no defense to knight takes c2. White went rook c5, I think trying to at least target the c6 pawn, but now I went knight takes c2 anyway, and again, it's not even just about the c2 pawn, it's also about the d3 pawn now being very weak, and my bishop having a monster diagonal to play with. So even if he gets c6, you know, these endgames are not going to be good because he's going to have a 5 versus 4 potentially if he trades everything, and very passive pieces. For instance, let's say rook takes c6, queen takes b3, queen c2, takes, bishop takes d3, and I believe there's no way to hold this position, even though white is just a pawn down. The difference in the activity of the bishops is extraordinary, and having a protected passed pawn should be quite valuable. For instance, if white goes rook c7, let's say, I think I have many options here, but one option that's quite attractive is g5. And the point is that I weaken this pawn chain a little bit, because if he takes here, now the e5 pawn is very loose, and if he just keeps the tension, then I'll take on f4 potentially and attack the f4 pawn. Although it probably would be smarter to start with rook b4 so that I'm actually threatening f4 and he can't support the pawn with king g3. So just a really tough position, and even the endgames now are extremely bad because this bishop is too passive, and I have a very, very compact pawn structure whereas white's can be easily undermined. So yeah, it's just a tough spot. Knight takes c2 is just domination. It actually turns out that knight takes c2 isn't the best move, and it probably just illustrates just how good my position is. The computer actually wants to play rook a8 and argue that there's no need to rush to take the c2 pawn. I'm protecting c6, and now I can actually invade with rook a3 or rook a2. So the computer outline actually goes king h2, rook a3, bishop f1, king h7. Again, a nice bit of prophylaxis just to stop any back rank checks. Queen d4, and now knight takes c2. And you see the difference here is that, the position's quite similar. I'm still a pawn up, but now the d3 pawn that's very weak is still on the board as well. So it's a monster position for black. Instead, I decide to obviously recoup my material right away, or get a pawn right away. And after knight takes c2, white acknowledged that the endgame was losing and decided to play knight d2 and protect his knight. But you can't lose this pawn on c2 and manage to think you can survive. So now I just went knight b4 back, and I'm protecting the c6 pawn and now targeting d3. So it's just completely over. If I wanted to be fancy, I actually could have gone bishop takes d3 here, but I decided there was no need for such shenanigans, even though this would be winning. Note that queen takes d3, queen takes d5 is a winner, and if rook takes c6, my queen could just invade with queen e3. But I thought this was not particularly necessary, given that he had no moves, and I didn't want to give him any tactics or anything. And when you're in a winning position that's relatively simple, sometimes you want to keep it simple. You don't want to, play tactics. So after knight b4, d4 is played, just trying to protect that pawn. But now look at how amazing this diagonal is for this bishop. It's just a monster. And again, the difference in bishops is extraordinary. And okay, you might say my extra pawn is a backward pawn, but all of my pieces are so active that I'm going to get more than just this pawn. And after d4, I played queen a6. And the point is now my queen is infiltrating on the diagonal that was just pried open by d4. White now played bishop f1, challenging my queen on that diagonal, stopping queen e2. And now I went queen a4. And from a4, I'm still protecting c6. Not that I needed additional protection. The knight was sufficient. And I'm now eyeing a new square in White's camp, queen d1. And you can see here, because White has pushed all of his kingside pawns, the second rank is super weak and the king is extremely weak. And that was kind of the drawback from way back when with playing f4, is that the whole second rank would be permanently sensitive. So endgames were going to be favorable for me if I infiltrated, whereas I don't have the same problem. So again, you could see how early on White was kind of playing with a lot of short-term assets, and I had the long-term trumps, which if you've seen any videos on this channel, you know I care about. So anyways, after queen a4, knight b3 is played, trying to shut off this queen from d1. But this move is a blunder. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out which move here ended the game. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video. The next move was a winner-winner chicken dinner. Well, I'm actually pescatarian. I don't eat chicken, but that's neither here nor there. The winning move is knight a2. Or excuse me, I spoke too soon. I played bishop e4 check first, just to get my bishop to a nice active square. No big deal, no harm, no foul. And after king g1, I went knight a2. And the point is now there's just a double attack. The rook and the queen are hitting the knight, and the queen is hit by my knight. So he can't defend both, and he's going to lose a piece because wherever he moves the queen, I'll just play queen takes b3. And as a result, after knight a2, my opponent resigned. I was very, very happy with this game. I thought it was a nice recovery from my really shaky draw, my very lucky draw in round 7. And yeah, just a huge win that got me to, a pretty good score. I had 5.5 out of 8 going into the last round. And I had only played one GM up to this point because I'd played down too many rounds. But I knew that with 5.5 out of 8, I would have I'd play a strong GM in the last round and have an opportunity to get more rating and just play up, which is what you want to do in tournaments anyway. So I was very thrilled with this win. And again, I had a whole new lease on life and on the tournament after my miraculous escape. So I felt like nothing could go wrong. So I carried that enthusiasm over into the last round. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation via the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.